Jesus of Nazareth remains the most enigmatic, powerful and attractive figure at the heart of world culture. I don't think anyone who's followed the stories of the last few years would deny that. Every time there's a new claim about Jesus, it hits the headlines, certainly in America and quite often in other parts of the world as well. But are these really new stories about Jesus, or are they simply ways of putting a wash on the old ones? What do we really know about Jesus? Can we know very much about him at all, actually? And what was Jesus himself actually like? What was driving him? What was calling him? What was making him act in the way that he did? And why, particularly, did he go to his death? Those are questions about which many people, myself included, have spent a long time studying and many pages and much ink writing. But I hope we can just summarize them and home in on the key elements in this short section now. First, we can know quite a lot about Jesus. Okay, we don't know how tall he was. We don't know whether he was going thin on top even at the age of 30, as some of us were. We don't know what he liked for breakfast. There are lots of things which, if you were writing a modern biography about Jesus, you wouldn't be able to find any details of at all. But we do know that Jesus lived within that great strand of hope, the hope of ancient Israel, which I was talking about in the last session. We do know that Jesus spoke particularly about one great theme, the time when God was going to become king. All our sources of any reliability at all point to that, and we can begin to tease out what he thought that meant. What about the sources, though? Are they actually as reliable as some have claimed? It's become very fashionable for quite a long time now, a couple of hundred years at least, to say that if we can produce a skeptical, cynical, questioning, doubting reading, that shows that we're sophisticated and kind of intellectually upmarket over against those poor, benighted people who don't think any such thoughts and just take everything that they're told at face value. Well, as a historian, I want to probe all the sources. I want to look at every scrap of evidence. I want to ask the hard questions and to face them as best I can. But as I do that, that doesn't mean that I must find a result which says that everything people used to believe is wrong and the new clever story that I can tell must be right instead. In fact, as most historians, ancient historians and modern historians would say, somebody who comes along and sweeps everything off the board and puts up some wacky theory of their own is pretty much likely just to be having you on and to be going after big sales figures overnight rather than actually serious historiography and getting back to what actually happened. Because the fact remains, whether some people in our culture like it or not, that Matthew and Mark and Luke, and in his way, which is a different way, John, remain as the most reliable sources by a very, very long way for anything that we can actually know about Jesus of Nazareth. Well, you say they were written by Christians who had a vested interest in it. Well, yes, of course they were. Would you rather have a life of some famous composer written by somebody who was close to them, who understood their music, who'd actually played it, or by somebody who lived in a different culture and actually made a virtue of being tone deaf? I'd go for the person who could understand the stuff. And when we move away from Matthew, Mark, Luke and John into some of these other much vaunted Gospels, so-called, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Mary, what we find again and again is that, to begin with, they're much later, despite claims that are sometimes advanced. They're much later than the four Gospels we find in the New Testament, and that they breathe a different air. And here's the crunch. It isn't the air of first century Judaism. It is the air of a rather non-Jewish philosophy of at least 100 years after the time of Jesus. That's another story for another occasion, perhaps. But when we then go back to the sources that we are actually sure are pretty early, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and perhaps the sources that underlie them, though they're a little harder to tease out than people sometimes try to make out, we do find a remarkably compelling story. And I don't just mean compelling in the sense that we find it grabs us, though it does. I mean compelling in the sense of compelling historically. It makes sense within the world of the 20s and 30s of the 1st century AD, as we now call it. Jesus was actually born pretty certainly about 4 or 5 or 6 years BC. The people who did the calculations for BC and AD got it slightly wrong, not very wrong, but a bit. And the date of his crucifixion isn't certain, but it was more or less around the year we call 30 AD. And the point is this: when we examine all the sources we can possibly find to understand how Jewish people in that period thought, what motivated them, what made them tick, and when we understand what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are actually saying, as opposed, please note, to what many subsequent centuries, including many Christian interpreters, have thought they were saying, then we find that again and again it fits like a glove. Here is Jesus coming as a young prophet. People thought he was a prophet. He spoke of himself as a prophet, coming to the people in Galilee and the northern part of the Holy Land and saying, the time is fulfilled. Now is the time for God to become king. What does that mean? The kingdom of God is at hand. I was speaking to a large group of young people the other day, and I expressed it like this. I asked them, what would it be like if God was running this whole show? And I spoke about world events and local events and events in their own lives. What would it be like if God was in charge here and was running things? That's what the phrase kingdom of God means. God becoming king. It isn't a matter of a kingdom as a place, certainly not a matter of kingdom of heaven in the sense of a place called heaven where we go when we die. Jesus had very little to say about what would happen after we die. Oh, he believed in life after death. He believed that God would look after his people. He believed that God would raise them from the dead at the last. That's very clear and very important. But that wasn't the focal point of what he was talking about. Jesus didn't come to give us a good moral example or fine teaching about true doctrine or to tell us the secret way by which we could go to heaven after we die. Jesus came to do something much more important. He came to fulfill what Israel's God had long ago said would happen to Israel and actually to God himself. That's running a little bit ahead of ourselves. When we get Jesus preaching the kingdom, announcing that God was becoming king, what we find is that he was going around doing things. He was celebrating a party, often with all the wrong people. He was healing people. There seems little doubt now from a scholarly, historical point of view that Jesus really did heal lots and lots of people. That's principally why crowds gathered to come near him and then to hear what he was saying. Jesus was doing things, particularly that business of feasting with the wrong people, which got him into trouble, which made some of the righteous people a bit suspicious about him. He's gone to dinner with a man who's a sinner. What on earth is this fellow all about, they used to say. And many of the teachings of Jesus, the parables where he uses stories to open up people's worldview, the way they were seeing things at the time, and to suggest that there's a different way of doing it, many of those stories were told in response to the question, what do you think you're up to? How dare you do that? Jesus was going around acting as if he had the authority to tell the Israel of his day what God wanted of them, and even to say on his own authority, it used to be said like this, but I'm saying it to you like that. Jesus was behaving with a kind of a sovereign freedom within and through the traditions of Israel itself. But Jesus was also claiming to fulfill, gloriously to fulfill, what the prophets had spoken. And it's within that context that we can begin to get a handle on what he thought was going to happen. I've often asked friends who have studied Jesus, what do you think Jesus thought would happen next once he'd walked around Galilee, healing rather a lot of people, teaching in rather a lot of parables, challenging the rich and respectable and having all these parties? Was that it? Was it just a matter that his followers are going to go on doing pretty much the same thing? Forever and ever, amen? Would that be what it would be like when God became king? No, because Jesus was heir to other deeper and in some ways darker traditions as well. One of them, for instance, comes in the book we call the prophet Daniel. And Daniel, written, probably compiled through various centuries, but written at times of great persecution and trouble for the people of Israel. And Daniel draws on the ancient, the older writings of the Jewish tradition in order to cast a spell, to create a picture which comes to its full flowering in chapter 7 of his book, which Jesus refers to many times. A picture of monsters coming up out of the sea to attack the people of God. Imagine the Middle East with great creatures. Actually, this was a picture for armies, for foreign invaders coming to attack Jerusalem. They're coming up the escarpment, and here is this poor little benighted nation at the mercy of these monsters. And in the picture, the monsters are facing this human figure, one like a son of man, one like a human being. And the human being seems to be crushed by them, seems to be attacked by them. But then God takes his seat. God is established as king, and the one like the Son of Man, the representative of God's people, is brought upwards to sit beside God on his throne. This is the great moment of exaltation and vindication when the monsters get their comeuppance and when God becomes king at last. Now, many Jews of Jesus' day interpreted that picture in terms of pagan armies invading and then God vindicating Israel as his people. Jesus spoke and acted as if he were somehow Israel in person, as if he would take upon himself the destiny and calling of Israel. And remember what that destiny was: to be the people, Abraham's people, through whom God would put the world to rights. Israel as a whole couldn't do it, because Israel, though the bearers of the solution, was also in itself part of the problem. Jesus would come and stand in for Israel as Israel stood in for the world. And what would that mean? He would take the force of evil upon himself so as to exhaust it, and then in the vindication which he knew would come from the one he called Abba, Father, he would inaugurate God's new sovereign reign that would eventually put the world fully to rights at last. There was another picture that Jesus drew on, which is very closely twinned, both in his teaching and in that of some other Jews of the time, with Daniel chapter 7. And this is the picture of the servant from Isaiah 53. The picture of the servant is a famous picture from not only Isaiah 52 and 3 actually, but also other passages close beside it in the book of Isaiah. But we need to read the whole central section of Isaiah to get the full force of what's going on. Isaiah chapters 40 to 55 speak about God's purposes for Israel and through Israel for the world. Even though the world is in a mess ruled over by pagan deities and pagan overlords, even though Israel is in a mess and unable to be the people that God wants Israel to be, nevertheless, God's servant, who somehow is Israel, but also stands over against Israel, will be the one who will come and be God's servant to the uttermost and actually suffer death, a cruel, unjust, shameful death, and as the prophet says, wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. There is no one image, there is no one illustration that can get us to the very heart of all the meaning of the cross, the meaning that Jesus had in his head, the meaning that the early Christians saw as they looked back in awe and gratitude and wonder at Jesus' death. Strange as it was, coming at the end of such a short public career, short but vivid time of announcing God's kingdom. But somewhere at the heart of it, there seems to be the idea of Jesus as the King of the Jews fighting the real battle against the real enemy. This theme goes way back, of course, like so many other themes do, within the story of Israel. The king was the one who would fight the battle. David fought against Goliath, the Philistine giant, and slew him with his sling and then chopped off his head. And David wasn't king at the time, but that was one of the things that projected him forward to make the present king jealous and to get David the kingdom at last. Among the great subsequent kings were ones who fought other battles, and indeed, 200 years before Jesus, there was a man called Judas Maccabeus who fought a great battle against a Syrian megalomaniac king and defeated him, and though he wasn't actually a part of the royal family, that action was enough to get him and his subsequent family into a monarchical role for the next 100 years. So fighting the battle against the real enemy is one of the things that the king has to do. But Jesus didn't think that the real enemy were the Roman soldiers who were crucifying him and the Roman governors who were taxing his people and so on. Jesus thought the real enemy was evil itself. Evil, if you like, with a capital E. Evil that could take almost personal force and whisper in your ear like a demonic voice, or go shrieking through the lungs of some poor benighted soul, or worse still, would come and infect a whole people with a wrong image of who God was, an image that said, actually, God is going to defend us whether we're good or bad, whatever we do. Jesus saw evil taking up residence even in the official structures of Israel itself, in the high priesthood, in those who were running the temple and doing it in such a shambolic way. And Jesus knew that it was his vocation to go to the place where evil was doing its worst and to take the full force of that evil on himself, so that dying under it without colluding with it by cursing his enemies or anything like that, he would exhaust its force and thereby be able to launch God's new creation. And that, of course, is what the early Christians said he had done, because they said that 3 days after he died, God had raised him from the dead. This doesn't mean, as many in our day have imagined it means, that, if you like, Jesus' body lies a mouldering in the grave while his soul goes marching on. That's precisely what resurrection isn't about. Resurrection is about new embodiment after having been very thoroughly dead. It isn't the resuscitation of a corpse, but nor is it the transposition of one's life into a disembodied soul. It is a new embodiment, an embodiment into a life which now pain and suffering and death can't touch. We have never seen a life like that. Bodies for us, whether they're made of wood or stone or human flesh, are always ultimately corruptible. But the early Christians grasped, and I think they grasped it because they met it in Jesus himself, the idea that after death, those who belong to God will be transformed at some later stage into a newness of life in which heaven and earth really have come together, and they are given a new body which is a different sort of creation altogether, one which corruption and decay can have no hold over at all. And that is the real meaning of the question of how evil is exhausted. Because, as I've said myself in various writings, we all know that from the time of Jesus' death to the present, there's still plenty of evil sloshing around in the world, and sometimes it seems extremely powerful. Rather, we have to look at it like this. We have to see evil as a quasi-personal force which did its worst to Jesus. The force which gathered itself in the corrupt religion of the leaders of his day. The force which gathered itself in the power of that ruthless and brutal empire of Rome of his day. They did their worst to Jesus, and Jesus took it all upon himself. And what came out was not that he was crushed and dismembered by it forever and ever, but rather God's new life emerged the other side. And Jesus in his death and resurrection has thus bequeathed to the world the promise that it will finally be set free from evil, because evil played itself out in its last great battle with Jesus himself. And Jesus pledged to the world the promise that it will be renewed, there will be a new world, because he launched it at Easter. There is much, much more to say about the death and resurrection of Jesus. But let's get hold of this, that in these events, according to the early Christians, the world, the great world of history, turned on its corner at last and came out of the darkness into the light. And with that light, we hear those voices echoing again, saying, "Come and follow me, and we'll find the answer to all those things that puzzled us."